Okay, good morning, everybody. Today's shir is in memory of Yitzchak ben Hachaver Moshe, whose yurtzeit is actually Purim Katan. So the actual day doesn't happen too often, about once every 3 years or so. But today being Purim Katan, Shemesh have a special aliyah. And today's topic, 421. Today's topic is the obligation to recite Birkas Hamazon. So the source is in Chumash. ושמרת את מצוות השם לקח ללכת בדרכיו לרעהו כי השם לקח מביאך אל ארץ טובה ארץ נחלים מים עינוס ותמוס יוצאים בבקעה בהר ארץ חיטה ושרה גפן תנאביון ארץ ודבש etc. Let's just jump down to the last pasuk ואכלת ושבעת וברכת את השם לקח הארץ הטובה אשר נשם לך. So the interesting point here actually is the pronunciation. If you we know you guys are Bali Kriya, so how you pronounce the word often impacts the meaning of the word. The most obvious example is V'avta, because it's not V'avta, it's V'avta, because it's the infinitive, it's a commandment, and you shall, you must love God. It's not when you love God, it's not descriptive, but it's a Lashon Tzivui. So it's pronounced V'avta, and the trup indicate that as well. We know wherever the trup is where the emphasis has to be. Right? That's the so. Here too, there's no obligation needs. It's v'chalta. Then it becomes seishir v'savata. However, the pronunciation is uberachta. Right? It's the infinitive, the commandment of Lashon Tzivui in that case. So now,
but otherwise, it would have just been what? How else could you interpret it?
Meaning, and you'll eat, you'll be satiated, and you'll bless. Meaning, it's not a classic Lashon Tzivui. It's not a classic infinitive, right? And it obviously leads to a sense of ambiguity to it. And besides, you don't really need to eat now, do you? Right? I mean, I guess you need to eat, but I can have water. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So even the language of the context, and again, it's in the Sefer Dvarim. It seems to be very descriptive. Right? At the end of the day, the context of these psukim are very descriptive. You can go to the land, there's going to be food, you're going to eat, And besides, if I'm just focused on the land of Israel, well, it's not a mitzvah tlabaretz, right? It's just an Israel-centered mitzvah. So again, hard to imagine that's the case, even though the context clearly is just the land of Israel. So we definitely have a lot of ambiguity here. And Ramban, number 2, has to be very careful. And he says, look, when you say v'achalta v'savatu be'rachta tiskor avuta mitzrayim v'inu hamidbar v'kasher tochal v'tispa ba'aretz hatova tevarech aleha et Hashem. That just like when you recall what took place in the Egypt and the suffering that took place in the desert, and just like you can be eating and you become satiated in the land, in this good land, also remember to bless and beseech the Almighty. Right? And we learn, and says the Ramban, and listen, Rabbatenu kiblu shizo mitzvah taseh. There's a tradition that this is a positive commandment. Now, v'tevarech Hashem lokacha, right? You must bless God. Just like va'asita makagagecha. There's sometimes the word va'asita is that Chazal understood it also to be Lashon Tzivur, right? And you make yourself a fence for your rooftop, right? In flat rooftops, they don't have issue with snow. So they have flat rooftops, and what do they do? When you have a rooftop that's going to be used, you need to put a fence around it. So again, it doesn't necessarily, it's not just good advice, it's a mitzvah in the Torah. So I think that's perhaps one could argue, no, it's just like a nice advice, right? Vasita petach l'Hashem l'kecha. When you make this Pesach l'Hashem l'kecha. So again, there, we see that the word vasita, again, it's not fair to how we know this, but we see that definitely the word vasita is used in the context of tzivui, is understood to be a positive commandment. And so you don't have to have this very clear language of commandment in order for it to be a commandment. The other example the Ramban gives is v'lakachtam reshit kol pri adama. It's not just being descriptive, it's and you must take from the reshit. You must bring the bikurim. You have to have. And that's what so it's hard to understand what exactly is the intent of the Torah. Is it being descriptive, or is it actually giving us providing an instruction? It's not always like that, right? It is often just descriptive. So, and the Ramban has to continue and say, listen, v'tama aretz hatova. So again, why is it referring to this land? Kamo val aretz hatova. What is al haaretz hatova? What do you mean on? It's v'al and on. Yitzaveh shetibarchu b'chol eight, that you're obligated to bless it every moment. Shetispa l'sova v'ashen tanach. When you become satiated, right, from the food, the sustenance on the land. But the Ramban has to say, even though yes, it's Israel-centered, the Ramban says, listen, it doesn't matter. It still pertains to Toronto. It still pertains to Thornhill as well. Because if I, was being very medactic in the Psukim, what's the source for having to do it in Toronto? It appears it's Israel-centered. The whole paragraph is talking about, right? If you take a look at source 1, the guy's bringing the land of Israel. So maybe you could argue it's land of Israel-centered, just like Shemitah, right? But it's not. And the Rambam also says in source 3, the mitzvah, the 19th mitzvah, shetzivanu levarcho yitalach kol achila, that we are obligated after we eat to recite a blarcha, as it says, v'achalta v'svato be'rachta Hashem v'lashona tosefta birkat hamazon min haTorah shenamar v'achalta v'svato be'rachta Hashem. The Kvayit Baruch Mishpatim Mitzvot Hashem zo b'mikamot b'mesachet brachot, as the Gemara really elaborates in brachos. And what's fascinating is that the mitzvah is specifically after we eat, right? Not before we eat. The doraisa is after, only when we're satiated. So the Meshech Chochmah gives us. We actually think we told this Meshech Chochmah way back when. Last year when we spoke about Birchas Torah. So now he's saying, how come when it comes to Birchas Torah we recite? Again, there are only two brachos that are biblical: Birchas Torah and Birchas Hamazon. Birchas Torah is recited before we learn Torah, and Birchas Hamazon is recited after we eat. Right? So why is it that for ruchnius, for spirituality, for Torah, it's before? When it comes to physical needs, specifically only once we're satiated. So that's his Meshech Chochmah. So what does he say? Minyan Birchas Hamazon min Torah, as it says. Fine. Quotes the pasuk. In the Elul Achar fun of Minayin, Amar Kavachomer, Kishehu Saveh Mevarach. When you become satiated, make a bracha. You'd think, what do you mean? Of course, you make a bracha before you're hungry. When you're full, you got to make a bracha. For sure, when you're hungry, you need to make a bracha as well. Okay, nonetheless, it's still only the Rabbanan. So here we go. V'tam nirem. What are we doing here? We're ultimately saying the following. We are wanting to bestow thanksgiving to God for what He's provided for us. Azu kavachomer, then the kavachomer makes sense. Ma al chayai sha'a mevarech, meaning for chayai sha'a, for something which is temporary, make a bracha. Well, chayai olam lo kol shegan, so much more so on this eternal life, meaning thanking God is something which is eternal. Right? So, v'chein mashehu sovei mevarech. Oh, sorry. I apologize. That's incorrect. That's referring to Birchas Torah. Meaning, if you make a bracha over food, which is chayei sha'ah, for sure you're going to make a bracha, which is something which is eternal, which is learning Torah. Right? V'chein mashehu sovei mevarech, and when you're satiated, kshu ra'ev l'kol shagan, and if you're hungry, for sure you have to make a bracha. Why? Shezet todah u'bracha avur gemulo shegemal lo shebrach. Because we're obligated to say thank you over the good of the good that one gives you. So once you're satiated and you've had an opportunity to partake in what God gave you, then that kind of kicks in your obligation of thanksgiving. Ach b'yamet, in a bracha al zeh bilvad. He says no. The brachas are even more than that. Rak hu inyan mechaven acher, mikivun acher. Shekeshe'ochel v'saveya, when you eat and you're satiated, as hu alul leva'it, you're much more likely to kick and rebel. As it says, meaning, when are we more likely to forget God? As they say, there are no atheists in a foxhole. But when are we, shall we say, maybe potentially more likely to forget God? When life is good. So I don't need God. God's been replaced. It's my strength. It's my, right? Lachen, tziva Hashem yisparach kisheyochav yisavea yazkir shem elokim b'torah yerchenu v'yiskor ki since it is that moment, meaning the Torah says, when are we obligated, meaning Torah, to provide thanksgiving? At the moment that we are least likely to thank God. And when we're least likely to thank God? When times are good. When times are peaceful. When we're satiated. Then we're much less likely to forget God. And that, says the Meshech Chochmah, is when we're specifically obligated. So So his first svara was on its idea of thinking, therefore you'll need to say thinking when you're satiated. And the second idea is, which I think is that, again, the Torah obligates you at the moment that you're least likely to do it, because when times are good, right, there are no atheists in a foxhole. When times are rough, then I understand why I'll specifically be providing a blessing, a bracha to the Ribono Shalom. And that's essentially the Meshech Chachma.
It's interesting because the two answers seem to somewhat be in
contradicting to each other
a little bit. But
yes,
at the same time,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. No, I agree because do you say that which one is more obvious? So I guess.
But it's that you're not likely to recognize God as much when you're satisfied because everything's good. But when you do recognize God, the thanks is even greater.
Yes, so I think that's how you have to understand the connection between the two, right? Yeah. Even though it's counterintuitive, yeah. I'm not, I understand I'm hungry. Thank God for the garab, right? Whereas, maybe we could use an example from our Christian friends. The Christians say grace before. After, maybe it's a bigger chiddush. Oh, no, that's raya. Maybe it is, not sure. Right? So maybe it's standard, before the meal, you thank God for giving you the food. But the bigger chiddush, maybe what requires it's less intuitive, is to do it afterwards. And perhaps that's the reason why the obligation, the Torah, is at that moment. I don't know, I'm not sure. That appears with the Meshech Chachma is saying. So there's a very interesting way of understanding, because if Berchas HaTorah is Min HaTorah, if Berchas HaMazon is Min HaTorah, we're going to run into what appears maybe to be a Gemara which is problematic. Source number 5 says, Tan Rabbanan, Mina yin the Berchas HaMazon Min HaTorah. How do we know? As it says, Shnemar, V'chata v'svatu v'erachta. Zo Berkat Hazan. Es Hashem Kacha, Zo Berkat Aretz. Al Aretz, Zo Berkat Aretz. Hatova, Zo Berei Yerushalayim. Chenu Omer Har Hatov Hazev Halvanon Asher Natzon Lach Zo Hatov Ametiv. Meaning, what do we see from here? That the Berkat Hamazon was actually made by various Nevi'im. It was made by Moshe, then it was done by Yoshua, right? Then it was done by David HaMelech. So I don't understand.
How do you see that?
Oh, because that's source 6. Amar Rav Nachman, Moshe Tikan Lisha Berkat Hazan B'Shar Shir Ed Lehaman. Moshe says, the man comes, bracha. Yeshua Tikan Lehem Berkat Aretz, Kivan Shenichasul Aretz. David Shlomo Tiknu B'nei Yerushalayim, David Tikan Al Yisrael, L'machavo Yerushalayim Rachav, Shlomo Tikan Al Abayit HaGadol VaKadosh. Hatov Metiv B'Yavne, Tiknua K'neged Harugei Beitar. So we see that the benching, shall we say, there are different amounts of benching that are added at different times. So it says the Rashba, I don't understand. How can you add? If it's Minatorah, it's Minatorah. What do you mean it's added on by Shlomo, added on by Yoshua? Is it Minatorah or not Minatorah? Is it what God wanted, or is it only because Moshe Rabbeinu came up with the idea? And if Moshe wouldn't have been mataking this bracha over the man, so there wouldn't have been in the Torah. I understand God says to say it. What do you mean Moshe was mataking because of the man?
It just seems to be like a asmachta, though, no?
But not asmachta. It's midoraita.
You know, but I'm saying these psukim seem to
right. So those psukim are the drashos, right? The dremes, right. Yeah. But again, and that's the Rashba's question. Source number 7. Hadam Rina Moshe Tikin Lehem Berkat Hazan, Yoshu Tikin Lehem Berkat Aretz. Kashali Vaha Kaima Lan Besof Brachot El Midoraisa Ninu. What do you mean? God wasn't. No, Moshe wasn't attacking Tefillin. God was attacking Tefillin, not Moshe. So what do you mean to tell me it's Doraisa and Moshe was attacking the bracha because of the man? What do you mean? God was attacking. So here's an important kalal. Yishtamai. Ba'an shehu tabu lahem. Meaning, the actual syntax and the language, yes, that was done by Moshe, Yoshua, Shlomo, David. The imi daraisa imratzala umra ba'izem atbesh yotze umra. Meaning, Torah, you have to say something. Thanks to the grub, right? However, then what happened? They were koveya the set tax. So midoraisa, anything goes. That's what you feel doraisa. However, comes along the Ashek Nestor Gedola, comes along the Nevi'im, and they establish a set fixed text of how to fulfill that biblical obligation. So the Midoraisa exists. How do you fulfill it in theory any way you want? However, various Nevi'im came along and were Toveh the actual text of how to do that obligation, and that is what we use, and that is what we say today.
How do we separate that from any other mitzvah, though? Because all mitzvahs, right, are not all mitzvahs.
Shofar. I take a shofar and blow it. There's no matbeya by shofar.
I'm sure there is. I mean, like the rabbis established a certain set.
Midoraisa. Okay, so exactly how many is midoraisa, right? 9, right? But meaning we see the tzkir shofar, a lulav and esrog. This is what you have to do. Obviously, there's Torah Shabbat Peh, which is midoraisa. What exactly is the arvei nachal, the kapot marim, right?
Yeah.
What is considered a Priyetz Hadar? What's a Priyetz Hadar? I don't know. Maybe it's a lemon. Maybe it's an apple. I don't know. Right? So yes, right. There's a doraisa component, but in terms of how do you fulfill the doraisa? So, by lulav it's easy. By shofar it's easy. Again, the number of times in the sounds are to some extent irrelevant, right? But how do I fulfill benching min Torah? En achinami. I can fulfill it. By the way, it's also true by davening. Because according to the Rambam, there's mitzvah to daven every day. So midoraisa, how do I fulfill that? By the certain, as long as I say a component of shavachada, then I'm finished. Comes on Chazal, and they're created a matbeya. They created a context, a syntax of how to fulfill that mitzvah. That's called the Amidah. That's right. So Chazal helped us fulfill the biblical obligation.
But is that right? That's not the same thing as Torah Shabbat Peh.
No, not Torah Shabbat. According to Torah Shabbat Peh, I don't need to say Bonei Yerushalayim al Haaretz Hamazon, right? Hey, so the Gemara learned that was darshan each component to it. Because I'll tell you why. Because if you say Torah Shabbat Peh, then you needed to say all those paragraphs since the beginning, and that's not the case. They never mentioned Yerushalayim, when? Only told David and Shlomo. So that can't be Torah Shabbat Peh. It's not like, until Shlomo came around, we only did 2 of the 4 minim, and then we added the 3rd, we added the 4th. No, of course not. From the outset, you had 4 minim. Masha'in Cain, by benching, the extra brachos that were added, they were added as historically as they were expanded on. I think that's a very important Rashba. Look at that. He actually says it. I actually didn't read this far in the Rashba. Last paragraph. Before they actually captured the land of Israel or built Yerushalayim, this wasn't part of benching. It was added afterwards. Meaning, we don't even say what David and Shlomo said. David and Shlomo said, may God continue to ensure that we have the great kingdom of David. Whereas today, we talk about its yearning and its rebuilding. So we've changed even what David and Shlomo did. So we kept the Bonei Yerushalayim, right? That God should build Yerushalayim, but David and Shlomo were doing it as may God sustain the building of Yerushalayim, whereas we long for the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. So once it was established that building Yerushalayim is part of it, it remained part of it. The actual language has to make sense based on the context of the day. So, okay, there's actually a very interesting Rav Kook, but we'll start with that. Maybe it's Hashem on Thursday. Have a good day.